Okay, welcome to Lesson 9, Shifts of Supply and Demand. In our last lesson, we learned about equilibrium, and we learned about what happens when supply and demand shift. So, for example, this is a little review. We took a look at this market equilibrium here. We have our supply and our demand curve. And for example, we learned that when a demand curve shifts, for example, in this case, we're going to use a demand curve increase or a shift to the right, we can see that what happens? Our price increases and our quantity increases. And again, that's a review from our last lesson. What we didn't learn was why does that happen? Why is it that from time to time the demand curve will shift to the right? Or in other words, at the same price, why would people be interested in buying more of a good? And there are a number of reasons for it. What I want to do is I want to go through essentially 5 different reasons why the demand curve can shift. Now, for each of the 5 reasons, we're going to do a demand increase, just like you see there on your screen. And I would hope that by the end of the lesson, after you know the reasons for the change, you could then take those reasons and then draw a simple graph like this to illustrate an increase in demand. We're going to use increase in demand for each of our examples, but I think it's fairly safe to say that each of these examples, the exact opposite, would result in a decrease in demand. But for all the examples I'm going to present here in the lesson, it's going to be an increase in demand just to keep things fairly simple. Okay, here we go. Reason number 1 for demand shifting to the right or increasing. This is sort of the broadest category. It's called changes in tastes and fads. Well, and I like to think of this as something like the Etch-a-Sketch or our friend the Rubik's Cube. If you were a kid growing up in the 1980s and the 1970s, these were 2 very, very, very popular toys. Since then, the demand for these goods probably is not as great as it used to be. Whereas today, you might have a few years ago, I think the big toy was Tickle Me Elmo. You know, trends, fashions, fads, popularity, all that sort of thing tends to affect demand for the good. In a lot of ways, this is the simplest one to understand. If something becomes more popular, demand increases. If something is less popular, demand decreases. That one's pretty straightforward. Okay, reason number 2 that demand changes. The price of related goods. Now, this gets a little confusing because you're going to think to yourself, wait a minute, didn't we learn in our previous lessons that the price doesn't affect supply and demand? And that's true. The price of the good doesn't affect supply and demand. That affects the quantity supply and the quantity demand. But the price of other goods does affect the demand for the good that we're speaking about. So, for example, I like to think first of complement goods. And peanut butter and jelly seems like the best example I can think of complement goods. And here's the rule. If the price of a complement good decreases, demand increases for the related good. So think about that. If the price of peanut butter decreased, people would consume more peanut butter, and therefore their demand for jelly would increase. Again, if the price of a complement good, and a complement good is a good that goes with something, that kind of pairs together with something else. If the price of a complement good decreases, demand increases for the related good. Now, the opposite of a complement good is what's called a substitute good. And bagels and donuts seem to be a good example of substitute goods, or goods that replace each other. And here's our rule with that. If the price of a substitute good increases, demand increases for the related good. Okay, so think about that. If the price of a donut goes up, I am less likely to eat a donut, and therefore, at the same price, I am willing to buy more bagels. My demand for bagels has increased. So again, if the price of a substitute good, a good that replaces a good, increases, demand increases for the related good. And I think if you think about it, that makes sense. Just quickly to review the difference between complements and substitutes. Complements are goods that go together, that work together. Peanut butter and jelly. Flashlights and batteries. Those are complement goods. Substitute goods are goods that replace each other. Bagels and donuts, juice and milk are goods that we probably wouldn't have both at the same time. We probably have one or the other. Okay. Factor 3 shifting demand is income. And that's not a big surprise. If you have more money, it's going to affect, or less money, it's going to affect how you consume, how much you consume, and how much you would like to buy things. The first type of good we're going to talk about is what's called a normal good. And a normal good is a good where income increases, your demand for that good increases. And the reason we call it a normal good is because that seems like the normal thing. Most things in this world, if we have more income, we will demand more of a good. And a cup of coffee at a fancy coffee restaurant, what might be a good example of a normal good. The opposite of a normal good, though, is what's called an inferior good. And inferior goods are goods that when income decreases, demand for the good increases. When you have less money, you'll actually purchase more of the good. And a classic example economists use of inferior goods is rice. Now, that's not always true. Depending on who you are, depending on your tastes and preferences, you might actually think of rice as a normal good, and you might think of coffee as an inferior good. Exactly who would think of which doesn't so much matter, but here's the rule. If in your case, when your income increases, you consume more of it, then to you it's a normal good. If when your income decreases, that's when you consume more of the good, then it's an inferior good to you. Oftentimes, inexpensive goods like rice, an old used car might be an inferior good. You'd rather buy a new one if you had more money, but since you don't, since you have less money, you're more likely to demand that particular good. Okay, factor 4. Expectations about future prices. That's a little bit confusing. And again, this goes back to our last lesson where you might say, wait a minute, you told us that price doesn't affect demand. Well, again, price of the good right now doesn't affect the demand for the good. It affects the quantity we demand of that good. But what we think is going to happen in the future to the price does affect how we behave right now. So, for example, if we think the price is going to go quite a bit up, then what are we going to do right now? Our demand will increase right now, and that makes sense. If you've heard on the news that next week gas prices are going to go up by 50 cents, there's a good chance you might take a stop at a local gas station and fill up while the prices are still low. That's going to increase demand. Of course, by contrast, if you believe that, let's say, tires are going to go on sale next week because you saw an advertisement for it, you might not go out and purchase those tires right now. You might wait a few days. That would obviously decrease demand right now. So what we think is going to happen in the future can affect our demand in the here and now. Okay, and our last one is, as you might guess from this picture here, population. And this is a pretty easy one. If the number of buyers increases, demand increases. And that makes pretty good sense, I think. Okay, let's do a little practice and see how we did here. See if we've got our skills down. By the way, just as a quick review before we do that, here's another look again at what just happened. All of what we just did was just showing why the demand curve does that, why the demand curve shifts to the right. All those things, tastes and fads, the price of related goods, what we expect is going to happen in the future, our income, and our population all affects the demand curve moving from one place to another. And of course, as a review again, when the demand curve shifts to the right, price increases and quantity increases. Okay, let's see how well we learned all that. We're going to start with an example of the demand for chalk. A very exciting product, chalk. Here's our first question. What would happen if more teachers are hired? Correct. The demand for chalk would increase. And by the way, just as a reminder, that means the price and quantity of chalk would increase. Equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity of chalk would increase. Why is that? Because in this case, the population of teachers has increased. And if our population of buyers increases, then the demand for the good increases. All right, here's another example. Erasers go up in price. Well, erasers are probably complements to chocolate. Excuse me, to chocolate. I must be hungry. To chalk. Therefore, if erasers go up in price, then demand for chalk decreases. If erasers are more expensive, we'll have less reason to buy chalk. And therefore, again, the price and quantity equilibrium would decrease. Here's another chance. Dry erase markers go up in price. Well, dry erase markers are probably substitutes for chalk. They would take their place. So if dry erase markers go up in price, we'd be less likely to buy dry erase markers, and therefore our demand for chalk would increase. Price and quantity would increase. Advertisement states that chalk will go on sale next week. Okay, we think chalk is going to be less expensive next week, and therefore right now we will buy less. Our demand will decrease. Price and quantity will decrease. And then lastly, teachers' income increase. Teachers' incomes increase. And chalk is a normal good. Well, if we have more income and it's a normal good, our demand will increase. Price and quantity will increase. All right, we've spent all this time so far talking about demand. It seems as though we should spend a little time talking about supply. So let's move on and talk a little bit about supply. Let's go back to our graph here again. And remember that with supply, when supply changes, in this case, again, we're going to do all increases. This is a supply increase or a shift to the right. Remember, we'll note that in doing so, price decreases and quantity increases. But again, why does supply increase? Why would a producer or a supplier be willing to produce more at the same price? That is what a supply increase means. Why would they do that? Well, there are 4 reasons this time that we're going to take a look at. Reason number 1 is actually probably the simplest: the number of producers. If there are more producers, the supply will increase. If there are more people who are willing to sell apples, there will be more apples for sale. That's a pretty logical conclusion. More producers mean more supply. And by the way, as this picture reminds us, of course, if there were less producers, the opposite would also be true. But generally, more producers means more supply. Less producers means less supply. Factor 1. Factor 2. Improvements in technology. More technology means goods are easier and cheaper to produce. So for example, if we think of the ATM machine, when it was invented, allowed banks to provide their service at a cheaper cost because they did not have to hire someone or as many people to do the job that the automated teller was doing. Of course, it was also a convenience to its customers, but it also reduced the cost. Anything that reduced the costs of producing a good will increase the supply of the good. In other words, producers will be willing to sell more of that good at the same price. So anytime the technology of producing a good increases or improves, it's easier and cheaper to produce the good, and so supply will increase. The third factor affecting a supply of a good is a change in the cost of inputs. Now, this tends to be a very broad category. What do I mean by that? Well, first, if the cost of inputs decreases, it is cheaper to make the good. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, if I was making, for example, I have a picture there of cocoa beans. If I was making chocolate, one of the major ingredients or inputs to making chocolate is the cocoa bean. Well, I guess it goes without saying, if the cocoa beans were cheaper, then it's easier and cheaper to make chocolate, and therefore producers are willing to make more of that good. Now, it's important to remember that inputs can mean a lot of things. It does, of course, mean raw materials like chocolate, the things that go into cocoa beans go into making chocolate. But we also forget it. The biggest other input we need to conclude is labor. Our workers mean a lot more. It's mean a lot of cost to a company. So, for example, If workers suddenly had a pay decrease, that would be a major decrease in the cost of one of the inputs going into making chocolate, and that would increase the supply of chocolate. Of course, it also includes the cost of raw materials, and it even includes costs of things that we might not think about, like, for example, if they had to borrow money to start the company to make that chocolate. Well, if those costs uh, had decreased, if interest rates, let's say, had gone down, then the cost of producing the good would decrease, and so the supply would increase. So the summary of all this is anytime we have something being used to make the good, both the raw materials or the labor or any related cost, if those costs decrease, then the supply of the good will increase. And then lastly, future expectations. If producers believe prices will decrease in the future, they and lastly, future expectations. Number 4. If producers believe prices will decrease in the future, they will increase supply now. And that sort of makes sense. If they believe they're going to not get as much for the good in the future, they will do everything they can to bring their products to the market right now. And I have a picture of a gas meter and a gas pump there because that's a very common tactic that gasoline companies use. If they know prices are going to go down in the future, they will often ramp up supply in the short run to sell as much gasoline as possible to take advantage of the higher prices. And of course, the opposite would also be true. If they knew prices were going to increase in the future, they might hold back some of their supply, so that they could sell more of it later on. So what we believe is going to happen in the future also affects the supply of a good. Okay, let's try a little review here first. Again, what did we just talk about? Reasons why supply would increase. And again, what does a supply increase look like? Supply increase is a shift to the right that results in a price decrease and a quantity increase. With the 4 reasons we just talked about, let's do a little practice and see how we did. Let's go back to our chalk, except this time we're going to look at it from the perspective of supply. Our first example, chalk packaging becomes more expensive. Okay, chalk packaging must be one of the factors or inputs that goes into making chalk overall. So if the packaging has become more expensive, the supply would decrease, which as a reminder means price will increase and the equilibrium quantity will decrease. All right, let's see, an increase in the number of chalk producers. Well, if there's more people making chalk, we should have a supply increase. Price will decrease and equilibrium quantity will increase. A chalk maker believes prices will increase in the future. If that's true, he'll want to sell more in the future, so he'll probably try to hold back his supply. So supply will decrease, which means price will increase, and equilibrium quantity will decrease. And finally, a new machine is invented that packages chalk much faster. Well, that's going to make the production much cheaper and easier, and therefore supply will increase, which means the price of chalk will decrease and the equilibrium quantity of chalk will increase. Okay, that completes lesson 9. Please move on with your activities in lesson 9.